Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the very edge of England. Not the soft, rolling edge where farmland meets a gentle cove, but the hard, jagged, uncompromising edge where the land simply gives up and drops away into the sea. The kind of coastline that doesn't apologize for itself. Granite cliffs the color of old pewter, worn smooth in some places and splintered sharp in others, rising out of black water that never quite stops moving, never quite goes quiet, even on the calmest of days. There is always sound here, a low, drawn-out breathing of the ocean against the rock, a hiss and a sigh, a hiss and a sigh, over and over, like something enormous sleeping just below the surface. And rising above it all, at the very tip of a rocky promontory where nothing else dares to grow, is the lighthouse. It is not a grand structure, not in the way that cathedrals or country houses are grand. It doesn't announce itself with arched windows or ornamental towers. It is simply a tower, white or pale grey, or sometimes a streaked and weathered cream, round and tapering slightly as it climbs, built from stone that was cut and hauled and mortared into place by men who understood that this tower had to stand long after they were gone. It has to stand against everything the Atlantic or the North Sea or the Irish Sea cares to throw at it. And it does. Year after year, decade after decade, storm after relentless storm, it stands. At the top of that tower, behind thick glass panes that are slightly curved and always smudged with salt, no matter how recently they were cleaned, the light turns. It has been turning since dusk. It will turn until dawn. A slow, mechanical revolution, patient as clockwork, steady as a heartbeat. Each full rotation sends a broad beam sweeping out across the water, reaching miles into the darkness in every direction, a pale arm of light feeling its way across the surface of the sea, searching, warning, promising. This is the Victorian Lighthouse, and inside it, quiet and alone, is the man who keeps it. The Victorian era in Britain, which we broadly think of as stretching from 1837, when Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, to 1901, when she died, was a period of extraordinary industrial and social transformation. Railways spread across the country like cracks in old ice. Factory towns swelled and roared and smoked. The British Empire reached into nearly every corner of the world. Commerce and trade and shipping expanded at a rate that would have been unimaginable to the generation before. And all of that shipping, all of those merchant vessels and packet boats and passenger steamers and fishing trawlers depended on navigating the waters around Britain's long, wrinkled, treacherous coastline. The coastline that was famous not just for its beauty, but for its danger, for its hidden reefs and shifting sandbars, for its sudden fogs and sudden gales, for the way it could swallow a ship whole on a night when the clouds came down low and the helmsman made one small, fatal miscalculation. The lighthouse was the answer to that danger, or at least the closest thing to an answer that the Victorians could manage. A fixed point of light in a shifting... The lighthouse was the answer to that danger, or at least the closest thing to an answer that the Victorians could manage.
a fixed point of light in a shifting world, a signal that said, "Here is the rock, here is the shoal, here is the headland you must not sail past too closely. Turn, adjust, there is a safe way through, and this light will show you where it is." But a lighthouse without a keeper was just a cold stone tower. The light had to be lit every single evening without exception, and kept burning and tended through the night, and extinguished properly at dawn, and then cleaned and maintained and wound and oiled and polished, ready to be lit again that evening, every evening, without fail. The ships were counting on it. The sailors whose lives depended on that beam of light turning reliably through the darkness were counting on it. They would never know the keeper's name, they would never see his face, but somewhere out there on the water, on a black night with the wind rising and the bow lifting and crashing, a man would see that light and know where he was, and that knowledge might be the difference between going home and not going home at all. That was the lighthouse keeper's purpose. That was the weight he carried. That was the quiet, enormous, entirely unsung responsibility that governed every hour of his day and every hour of his night for as long as he served at his post.
And what a life that was! What a strange, solitary, demanding, rhythmic, often beautiful and often grinding and occasionally terrifying life. A life built on routine so deep it became a kind of meditation. A life in which the distinction between work and existence dissolved almost entirely, because the lighthouse was always there, always turning, always needing something, and the keeper was always in it, always at its service, until the day he wasn't. Tonight, we are going to step inside that life. We are going to walk up those winding stone stairs, feel the salt air on our faces, smell the oil and the lampblack and the clean cold of the sea, and spend some quiet hours understanding what it meant to be one of those solitary men who stood between the darkness and the deep, keeping a light burning so that others might find their way. So settle in. Let the sounds of wherever you are fade down to almost nothing. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts drift, and your body sink a little deeper into wherever it rests. We are going somewhere calm and cold and quiet, somewhere at the very edge of the world, and the light is already turning. Section 2. Becoming a keeper, appointment and arrival. In the Victorian era, the body responsible for lighthouses around the coast of England and Wales was an ancient and rather grandly named institution called Trinity House. Founded by royal charter in 1514 under Henry VIII, Trinity House had grown over the centuries from a guild of mariners into the official authority for the management and maintenance of lighthouses along the English, Welsh, Channel Islands and Gibraltar coastlines. By the Victorian period, it was a well-established and deeply bureaucratic organisation, with its own uniform, its own rules, its own hierarchy of personnel, and its own particular way of doing things, which was to say, carefully, formally, and with a great deal of paperwork.
To become a lighthouse keeper under Trinity House was not, in the early Victorian era, necessarily a matter of specific qualification. Many of the men appointed to positions in the early part of the period were former sailors, ex-Royal Navy men who knew the sea and its dangers from the inside, who had grown up on ships and understood instinctively why the work of lighthouse keeping mattered. Others were veterans of various military campaigns, men who had served the Crown in some capacity and were being given a modest, steady posting as a quiet reward for that service. And some, more candidly, were there because of who they knew. In the early decades of the century, lighthouse postings were in some cases political appointments, offered by patrons to men who had the right connections, rather than necessarily the right experience.
But Trinity House, as the Victorian period progressed, worked steadily to professionalize the service. Rules were written down, then revised, then expanded again. By 1858, the official instructions for lighthouse keepers had grown to a document of 87 printed pages, laying out in meticulous detail the responsibilities, conduct, and daily duties expected of every man in every posting, from a rock lighthouse off the Cornish coast to a harbour light at the mouth of the Thames. A keeper who wanted to keep his job had to be able to read those instructions and follow them, which meant, somewhat quietly, that literacy had become a practical requirement, even if it wasn't always formally stated as one. The hierarchy within a lighthouse station was straightforward. At the top was the principal keeper, the man ultimately responsible for the light and everything connected with it. Beneath him, at larger stations, were 1 or 2 assistant keepers. And at some postings there was also a supernumerary assistant keeper, a man still in the process of finding a permanent placement, learning the trade at various stations before being assigned somewhere of his own. The relationship between principal and assistant was something like that between a ship's captain and his crew, formal and clearly defined, with the principal's authority unquestioned in practice, even if it was occasionally questioned in private.
Now imagine you have been appointed. You have received your letter from Trinity House, signed in neat official script, informing you that you are to report to your posting at a lighthouse on, say, the southwestern coast of Cornwall. The letter does not ask whether you are ready. It does not inquire about your preferences or your concerns. It simply informs you where you are to go and when you are to be there. This is not an invitation. It is an instruction. Getting there was, depending on the posting, a matter of varying difficulty. Some lighthouses were close to towns, accessible by road, situated on a headland that a reasonable man could walk to from the nearest village. These were considered informally the comfortable postings. You might not enjoy luxurious accommodation, but you could at least have a conversation with a local shopkeeper once in a while, receive letters in a timely fashion, perhaps even attend church on a Sunday. Other postings were something else entirely.
There were rock lighthouses, built not on land at all, but on isolated outcrops of rock that emerged from the sea just far enough above the waterline to provide a foundation for a tower. Bishop Rock, off the Isles of Scilly, sat at the western tip of this cluster of islands, with nothing but open Atlantic Ocean between it and the coast of America. Getting to Bishop Rock meant a boat trip in whatever weather the sea chose to provide, a transfer by rope or by a small tender in the lee of the rock, and the experience of watching the boat that had brought you grow smaller as it moved away, leaving you on a few square yards of granite with nothing around you but water. The journalist who reviewed a BBC documentary about Bishop Rock in 1974 described it simply and perfectly. There is nothing between Bishop Rock Lighthouse and America except 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean and an awful lot of loneliness. But even in the Victorian period, decades before that documentary was made, the men who kept the light at Bishop Rock knew exactly what that sentence meant. They had felt it themselves the first time they arrived, stepping off the transfer boat onto the wet stone platform at the base of the tower, looking around at the horizon and finding it empty in every direction, and understanding in their bones what they had signed up for.
For a man arriving at a more accessible posting, the first impression of a lighthouse was often one of severe, almost austere orderliness. Trinity House took the appearance of its stations very seriously indeed. Walls were expected to be whitewashed, paths were to be swept, outbuildings were to be maintained in good repair. The general principle was that a lighthouse station was not merely a functional installation, but a visible statement of institutional pride, and keepers were expected to uphold that statement through constant, determined maintenance work. If an inspecting superintendent arrived to find peeling paint on the cottage walls or rust streaks on the iron railings, the keeper responsible could expect a formal reprimand in his record and a note about the matter in the station's official log. The keeper's accommodation itself was modest, a stone cottage, usually adjacent to the base of the tower, with a small parlour, a kitchen, a bedroom or two for the keeper and his family if they were permitted to live with him, and sometimes separate quarters for the assistant keeper. The furniture was plain and practical. The floors were stone or simple wooden boards. The windows were small, designed more to resist the wind and rain than to let in light. And over everything, permeating the walls and the curtains and the very air of the place, was the smell. Oil, coal, salt, the particular, slightly sweet, slightly acrid smell of lamp fuel and lampblack, of metal polish and brass fittings, and underneath it all, always, the cold mineral smell of the sea. This was home, for however many months or years a keeper would serve at any given station. This was the world he had been appointed to inhabit, to maintain, and to make his own. Some men resented it. Some men, rather to their own surprise, loved it, with a quiet and complete devotion they could not have anticipated on the day they received their letter from Trinity House. And either way, it didn't much matter. The light needed keeping, and that was that. Section 3. The lighthouse itself. Stone, glass, and iron. Before we can understand what a keeper's life felt like, we need to understand the structure he inhabited. Because a lighthouse is not merely a building. It is a machine, a purpose-built instrument of very specific function, and every element of its design reflects that function with a kind of ruthless clarity. There is no excess in a well-made lighthouse, no room given over to decoration or luxury, or anything that doesn't serve the central overriding purpose of getting light up as high as possible and sending it as far as possible across the water. Victorian lighthouses came in several architectural styles, and the period saw considerable innovation in lighthouse design and construction. Some were built in the Greek Revival style that had been fashionable in the early decades of the century, with clean, classical lines and a certain noble severity. Others reflected the Gothic revival that swept through Victorian architecture more broadly, with pointed details and a sense of solemnity that their designers perhaps felt was appropriate for a structure that stood between mariners and death.
But whatever the stylistic flourishes on the exterior, the fundamental structure was always the same. A round or octagonal tower tapered slightly toward the top, built to resist the lateral force of wind and wave rather than the purely vertical force of gravity that more conventional buildings had to contend with. The walls were thick, extraordinarily thick in the case of towers built on exposed rocks or headlands. Some of the most robust Victorian lighthouse towers had base walls more than 2 meters thick, massive cylinders of stone or brick, or later in the period, cast iron and concrete, designed to remain absolutely immovable when a wave the size of a house broke against the base of the tower and sent spray sheeting past the lantern room 50 or 60 feet above sea level. The weight of those walls, the sheer density and solidity of the structure, was what kept it standing when everything else around it was in motion. Inside the tower, the ground level was typically given over to storage. Oil for the lamp had to be kept in quantity, and it was heavy, so it was stored low, in the base of the tower, where its weight would contribute to stability rather than undermine it. There might be containers of spare wicks, cleaning materials, tools for minor repairs, spare parts for the mechanical apparatus above, all of it organized and catalogued, because nothing in a lighthouse station was left to chance or informal arrangement. Everything had its place. Everything was accounted for in the station's supply record. Above the storage level, the tower was essentially a very tall, very narrow staircase, winding upward around a central column, each step cut from stone and worn smooth by years of the keeper's feet, going up and going down, going up and going down, hundreds of times in a single week, thousands of times in a year. The staircase was the keeper's daily journey. He knew every step, every irregularity in the stone, every place where the step was a fraction higher than the others and required just a small extra lift of the foot. He could, and sometimes did, climb it in complete darkness, on overcast nights when the moon gave no light and a candle might gutter and die in the draught, navigating purely by feel and long memory. Part of the way up the tower, there was usually a watch room, sometimes called the service room. This was a small chamber, not much larger than a generous closet, where the keeper could sit during his night watch without having to stand in the full cold of the lantern room above. Here he might have a small chair, a tiny table, his logbook, a clock, perhaps a volume or two from the portable library that Trinity House distributed to its stations in later decades of the century. It was not a comfortable room. It was barely a room at all, really, just a widening in the tower, a pause in the stone before the final ascent. But for a man sitting a long night watch through a winter gale, it represented the difference between endurable discomfort and genuine suffering. And at the very top of the tower, reached by a hatch or a small iron door, was the lantern room. This was the heart of the lighthouse, the room for which everything else existed. A circular chamber surrounded on all sides by thick glass panes set in a cast iron frame, topped by a copper or iron dome through which the heat of the lamp could escape. The glass was not ordinary window glass. It was carefully made, specifically engineered to be as free as possible from imperfections, because any bubble or wave in the glass could distort the light passing through it and reduce its effectiveness. Keeping those glass panes clean was one of the keeper's most important and most frequent tasks. Salt spray built up on them continuously, depositing a thin film of minerals that, if allowed to accumulate, would progressively dim the light. Every morning after the lamp was extinguished, the glass was cleaned. Every morning, without exception, for as long as the keeper served. At the center of the lantern room, sitting on a cast iron pedestal, was the lens. But we will spend proper time with the lens in its own section, because the lens deserves it. For now, let us simply say that it was beautiful, and it was extraordinary, and it was the reason everything else existed.
Outside the lantern room, running around the exterior of the tower at the level of the lantern room floor, was the gallery. A narrow iron walkway, just wide enough for a man to stand on, surrounded by a low iron railing that had been repainted so many times it had lost any sense of individual brushstrokes and become simply a smooth, layered thing. The gallery was where a keeper would go to clean the outside of the glass, clinging to the railing in all weathers, working methodically around the circumference with his cleaning cloth. On calm days, on fine summer mornings, when the sea lay flat and glittering, and the sun was warm on the back of his neck, the gallery offered a view that was, by any measure, spectacular. The entire coastline visible in both directions, ships moving in the middle distance like toys, the curve of the earth visible on the horizon, so perfect and so vast, it made a man feel very small and very fortunate to be standing exactly where he was. And on bad days, on winter mornings, when the wind shrieked past the lantern room at 50 miles an hour, and the spray came horizontal, and the gallery railing was so cold it burned through his gloves, the keeper did the work anyway, and thought about warm things, and went back inside as quickly as duty allowed.
Below the tower, the keeper's cottage and any associated buildings formed a small compound, enclosed in many cases by a low stone wall that served partly to keep out the wind and partly to define the boundary of the station. Within this compound there might be a coal store, a small outbuilding for tools and equipment, and in some cases a modest garden. Not a decorative garden, not in the main, more often a practical one, growing whatever hardy vegetables could be coaxed from rocky, salt-sprayed soil. Kale and cabbage, root vegetables, herbs that could survive the coastal climate. Supplementing the provisions that arrived by supply boat with something fresh and homegrown was both a practical necessity and, for many keepers, a significant comfort. The act of growing something, of tending it, watching it respond to care and water and soil, provided a counterpoint to the mechanical routines of the light that was worth a great deal on a long, grey November afternoon. This was the lighthouse, stone and glass and iron, perched at the edge of the world, containing within its tower a small universe of duty and routine and solitude and light. And in the morning, when the lamp was extinguished and the lens draped, and the keeper descended the stairs to the warmth of the cottage kitchen, the structure stood empty and still, waiting for evening, waiting to begin again.
It was invented in 1822 by a French physicist named Augustin Jean Fresnel, and the best way to explain what it is and why it mattered is to start with the problem it was designed to solve. Before Fresnel, lighthouses had relied on relatively simple optical arrangements: burning oil or whale fat, a wick, a reflective backing, perhaps some basic lenses or mirrors to try to direct the light outward. The result was a light that was visible, certainly, but not powerfully so, and not over the great distances that ships navigating offshore needed.
The fundamental problem was that a flame radiates light in every direction, but most of that light goes straight up into the dome or sideways at angles that are not useful for warning sailors, or simply dissipates into the surrounding air and accomplishes nothing. What Fresnel understood and expressed in a lens of extraordinary elegance was a way to capture almost all of that wasted light and redirect it into a single, powerful horizontal beam. His lens was not made from a single piece of glass, but from multiple concentric rings of glass prisms, each one precisely angled, arranged in concentric circles around a central bullseye lens. Light entering from any angle was bent by these prisms, caught and redirected, until almost all of it converged into a narrow band of intensely concentrated illumination. The effect was dramatic. A Fresnel lens turned the diffuse glow of an oil flame into a beam of light that could be seen from 15, 20, sometimes even 25 miles out at sea in favorable conditions. When you see a Fresnel lens for the first time, and photographs of them are deeply worth seeking out, the experience is something like seeing a chandelier and a scientific instrument occupy the same space simultaneously. They are made in several sizes, called orders, with the largest first-order lenses reaching nearly 2.5 meters in height and perhaps 1.5 meters in diameter. They consist of hundreds of individual glass prisms, each one ground and polished to exacting tolerances, arranged in their concentric rings around the central lens. When assembled and placed in the lantern room and the lamp burning at its center, the effect was described by more than one Victorian observer as the most beautiful manufactured object they had ever seen. The light caught and distributed and concentrated by all those prisms created something that was simultaneously mechanical and transcendent, like a great glass eye open to the night. The Lighthouse Board that oversaw lighthouses in America during the equivalent period documented that the proper operation and maintenance of a Fresnel lens required the keeper to perform no fewer than 131 separate tasks. This was not unusual. Trinity House had its own equally detailed instructions. The specific procedures for lighting, maintaining, cleaning, and shutting down the lamp and lens were written out in careful methodical sequence, leaving, as one historical account notes, very little to the keeper's judgment. Step by step, wick by wick, prism by prism, the keeper was guided through his relationship with this extraordinary instrument. The fuel for the lamp evolved during the Victorian period. Early Victorian lighthouses often still used whale oil, a holdover from the previous century. Whale oil burned with a relatively clean flame and a good intensity, but it was increasingly expensive as whale populations were depleted by decades of intensive hunting, and it was heavy to transport to remote stations. The transition to colza oil, pressed from a type of rapeseed, came in the middle decades of the century, and by the later Victorian period, many lighthouses had converted to mineral oil, specifically kerosene, which burned more cleanly, more brightly, and was considerably less expensive. Whatever the fuel, the lamp itself consisted of a multi-wick burner, designed to achieve the maximum possible flame intensity within a constrained space. Multiple concentric wicks, precisely spaced, burning simultaneously, produced a flame of considerable power. But that power was also the source of constant work for the keeper. The wicks needed to be trimmed regularly, not cut precisely, but adjusted. The burned edge of each wick carefully tended to ensure that it burns evenly and without producing excessive smoke. A badly trimmed wick would produce a flame that smoked heavily, and that smoke would coat the inside of the lens with a thin layer of carbon that had to be cleaned away. The lens could not be allowed to become dirty. The lens had to be perfect. It had to be perfect every single night, because every night ships were out there depending on it. During the daytime, when the lamp was out, the lens was protected. A linen bag was drawn over it to keep dust and soot from settling on the prisms. The curtains around the lamp-room windows were drawn, both to protect the lens from direct sunlight, which could cause problems when refracted through the prism arrangements, and to prevent the glass of the windows from focusing any sunlight onto combustible materials inside the room. Then, as evening approached, the keeper would ascend the tower to begin the lighting procedure. The linen bag was removed, the curtains were drawn back, the oil reservoir was checked and filled as needed. The wicks were inspected and adjusted. The lens was given a final careful polish with a soft linen cloth, and the prisms examined one by one for any smudge or speck that might have been missed. And then the lamp was lit. The effect, standing in the lantern room when the lamp first caught and the lens began to gather its light and concentrate it into that searching beam, was unlike anything in ordinary life. The light in the room itself was not uniformly bright. The Fresnel lens directed most of the light outward into the horizontal beam, so the lantern room remained in a kind of dramatic chiaroscuro, the lens itself blazing at its center, the room around it relatively dim, the glass panes beyond lit only by whatever escaped the beam. Looking out from the gallery at a lighthouse in operation from any distance at all was to see something remarkable, a single point of intense focused light sweeping the darkness with a regularity and steadiness that was almost hypnotic.
The rotation of the lens was accomplished by clockwork. A system of weights suspended down the length of the tower drove a mechanical arrangement that turned the lens at a precise and steady rate. The rate of rotation was specific to each lighthouse, determining the characteristic flash pattern by which mariners could identify which lighthouse they were looking at. One lighthouse might show a single flash every 10 seconds. Another might show 2 quick flashes followed by a longer interval. A third might show a continuous, unbroken light. These patterns were published in navigational charts and almanacs, so that a mariner who could see a light but wasn't sure of his position could time its flashes and consult his reference material and know with considerable confidence exactly where he was. The light was, in this sense, also a language. Each lighthouse had its own signal, its own identity in the darkness. But the clockwork mechanism that drove the rotation was also one of the keeper's ongoing responsibilities. The weights that powered it had to be wound back up at regular intervals throughout the night, typically every few hours. This meant that a keeper keeping watch could not simply sit in his watchroom and wait for morning. He had to climb to the lantern room, wind the clockwork, verify that the lens was still turning at the correct rate and the flame was burning cleanly, check the fuel level in the reservoir, and then descend again, and return in another few hours to do it again and again, all through the night, every night, for years.
The keeper was the heartbeat of the lighthouse. The machinery was magnificent, but the machinery needed him. Without his regular winding of the clockwork, the rotation would slow and stop, and the warning beam would become a fixed point of light, losing the pattern that mariners relied upon for identification. Without his trimming of the wicks, the flame would produce smoke and begin to dim. Without his watching and adjusting and cleaning and replenishing, the whole extraordinary system would gradually fail. The technology and the human being were inseparable. Neither was sufficient without the other. And so, night after night, the keeper climbed his stairs and wound his clockwork and trimmed his wicks and polished his prisms, and the light turned and reached out across the water, and somewhere in the dark a ship adjusted its course, and no one was lost and no one was saved in any dramatic sense, just quietly kept out of harm by a light burning steadily in a tower at the edge of the world. Section 5. The Keeper's Day, a rhythm built on duty. There is something almost meditative about a routine so deep and so regular that it ceases to feel like routine at all and becomes simply the shape of time. This is what the Victorian Lighthouse Keeper's Day was. A sequence of tasks so thoroughly repeated, so carefully prescribed, so absolutely consistent from one day to the next, that a man who had served at a station for even a few months could have described his daily schedule in precise detail without consulting any written record, because it was written in his body, in his habits, in the automatic movements of his hands.
The keeper's day began before the sun. In the summer months, that meant rising in the early hours of the morning, sometimes well before 4 o'clock, to extinguish the lamp before full daylight made its continued burning a waste of fuel. In the winter, when the days were short and the nights stretched from mid-afternoon to mid-morning, the mathematics of the keeper's schedule were considerably more demanding, with the lamp burning for 16 hours or more, and the period for cleaning and maintenance compressed into the brief grey hours of a December day. The first task of the morning was the lamp itself. The keeper climbed the tower in the pre-dawn darkness, checked the clockwork, and as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue to the particular pale grey of a winter dawn at the coast, he extinguished the flame. This was not simply a matter of blowing out a candle. The lamp was extinguished by a specific procedure, reducing the wick carefully before the final extinction to avoid producing a surge of smoke that might coat the lens. Then the rotation of the lens was stopped. The lens was examined for any soot or deposit that had accumulated during the night's burning, and if any was found, it was cleaned immediately before the deposits had time to set.
The cleaning of the lens was the most delicate task in the keeper's entire day. The prisms were wiped with a soft linen cloth, each one individually, working methodically around the rings of the lens from bottom to top. The brass fittings of the lamp apparatus, the framework that supported the lens, the mechanical parts of the clockwork, all were polished. The oil reservoir was cleaned and examined. The wicks were removed, inspected, and either trimmed or replaced as needed. The whole procedure might take an hour or more, performed with the careful attention to detail that Trinity House expected, and that the keeper himself, if he took pride in his work, demanded of himself regardless of what the rule book said. Then the protective linen bag was drawn over the lens. The curtains were drawn to shield the room from the sun. The keeper descended to attend to the rest of his morning. Outside, the day's maintenance work awaited. Victorian lighthouse keepers were painters almost by definition. The salt air that characterized any coastal station was aggressive toward any painted or treated surface, causing paint to blister and peel and iron to rust at a rate that would have astonished anyone accustomed to inland conditions. The station had to be kept in good repair at all times, not merely for practical reasons, but because an inspection by a Trinity House superintendent could arrive with relatively little warning, and a station that showed signs of neglect would result in a formal note in the keeper's record that could affect his chances of promotion, and, in serious cases, his continued tenure at the station.
One keeper's son, James Sheridan, who grew up during the 1910s at a lighthouse where his father served, recalled later that the most consistent memory of his father's daily life was of a paintbrush in his hand. The government put great stock in painting, he said. It was not an exaggeration. Walls, railings, outbuildings, the exterior of the tower itself, the ironwork around the gallery, the garden wall, the coal store. All of it needed repainting regularly, and the keeper who kept up with it had a station that gleamed, and the one who fell behind had a station that told its own story of inattention. Between the cleaning and the painting and the practical maintenance, there were records to keep. The keeper maintained a detailed log of weather conditions, noting wind direction and strength, barometric pressure, temperature, visibility, the presence or absence of fog, the state of the sea. These records were not merely for the station's own reference. They were part of a broader network of meteorological observation that Trinity House and later the Meteorological Office used to build an understanding of weather patterns around the British coast. The keeper, in his daily recording of what he observed from his tower, was a scientist of sorts, contributing to a body of knowledge that would eventually form the foundation of modern weather forecasting. He also logged ships sighted, the numbers and types of vessels passing within sight of the station, their approximate direction and speed, any unusual circumstances. In the days before radio and reliable maritime communication, a lighthouse keeper who noticed something wrong with a passing vessel, a ship flying a distress signal or sitting oddly in the water or showing signs of fire, was one of the very few people in a position to do anything about it. The logbook was where these observations were first recorded, the beginning of whatever response was possible. The afternoon brought more maintenance work, more cleaning, sometimes the opportunity for the lighter occupations that the keeper permitted himself in the margins of his required duties. Those who had gardens tended them, those who kept animals, and some did, a few chickens, perhaps a goat, attended to them. Those who had the inclination read, or wrote letters, or pursued one of the crafts that isolated men have always found their way to, rope work, wood carving, the making and repairing of practical objects. As the afternoon light began to fall, the keeper turned his attention back to the lantern room. The routine of lighting was, if anything, more careful and methodical than the routine of extinguishing. Fresh fuel was prepared and loaded. The wicks were set precisely. The clockwork was wound and prepared. The linen bag was removed from the lens. The curtains were drawn back. Everything was checked against the checklist, every element of the apparatus confirmed as ready before the lamp was lit and the lens began to rotate.
And then the night watch began again, and the day's rhythm had completed its full circle, and tomorrow it would begin again in precisely the same way, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, for as many days as the keeper served at his post. This was the shape of his days, steady, repetitive, purposeful. Not exciting by the measure of adventure or novelty, but not without its own deep, quiet satisfaction either. There is something about performing necessary work with care and precision, about being the person who maintains the thing that must be maintained, that provides a kind of meaning that more varied and celebrated occupations sometimes fail to offer. The keeper who did his work well knew it. The light was burning, the lens was clean, the clockwork was wound, the logbook was current, everything was as it should be. That was enough. That was, on most days, exactly enough.
The official content of the log was clearly defined. Weather observations recorded at regular intervals throughout the day and night, wind direction, wind force on whatever scale the station used, barometric pressure read from the station barometer, temperature from the thermometer mounted in the shade outside the cottage wall, the state of the sea, the height of the swell, the presence or absence of fog. These entries were made in the same format, day after day, often in an abbreviated notation that became second nature after a few weeks at the station. A keeper who had served for a year or more could fill in a standard weather observation entry in under a minute. The shipping log recorded vessels sighted. The keeper maintained a continuous watch, particularly during daylight hours, and noted any vessel passing within sight of the station, the type of vessel, if identifiable, the direction of travel, any flags being flown. In the era before maritime radio, when a ship in distress had limited means of communicating its situation to anyone on shore, the lighthouse keeper was one of the few fixed observers with both the vantage point and the official responsibility to note what was happening on the water. His log entries about passing vessels were, in some cases, the only record that a particular ship had passed a particular point on a particular day, information that became critically important if that ship later went missing.
Supply records formed another category of the log's content. Fuel consumed, oil remaining, quantity of wick material used, cleaning supplies on hand, any maintenance materials needed for the station. These consumption records were used by Trinity House to calculate the supply requirements for the station's quarterly provisioning visit, and a keeper who maintained his supply records accurately could expect to receive adequate provisions. One who was careless or imprecise might find himself running short of lamp oil in the middle of winter, which was, to put it mildly, a problem that Trinity House did not look upon with sympathy. And then there were the other entries, the ones that fall outside any official category, the ones that, reading a Victorian keeper's logbook today, make you catch your breath slightly with the sudden intimacy of contact with a specific, individual human life.
The Trinity House archives in London hold many surviving logbooks from the Victorian period, and among them can be found entries of extraordinary candour and expressiveness. A keeper at Victorian Lighthouse off the coast of Cornwall left an account of the days he spent alone at his station after his fellow keeper had been taken ill and removed to the mainland, writing of the particular quality of that solitude with a directness that is still striking. He described how, after 54 hours of continuous watchkeeping, he had to allow himself a few hours of sleep. He described craving someone to talk with so intensely that he realized, with some shock, that for an entire week he had not uttered a single word, not in speech, not in song, not even to himself. He described being alarmed by a roaring sound that shook the tower, fearing he could not account for it, before eventually working out that heavy seas were entering a cave beneath the lighthouse from both ends and compressing the air, which escaped through a narrow passage with the force and sound of something like a lion's roar. The precision of that last observation is characteristic of keepers' logbooks at their best. Not just the fact of the mysterious sound, but the investigation, the hypothesis, the confirmation, the eventual understanding of what had been happening. These men were alone for long periods, with no other occupation than to observe and record, and some of them became extraordinary observers, their logbooks a detailed daily chronicle of everything the sea and sky around their station chose to do.
Weather descriptions in Victorian lighthouse logs sometimes achieve a quality that approaches literature without any apparent intention to do so.
A keeper writing a simple duty entry about a November storm might describe the color of the sky 2 hours before the storm arrived, the particular greenish-yellow light that experienced coastal observers knew as a warning sign. He might note the exact sequence in which the wind backed and then veered. He might record the height of the waves by reference to the tower itself, noting that at the peak of the storm, the spray was reaching the lantern room gallery 60 feet above mean sea level. These are not attempts at fine writing, they are attempts at accuracy. But accuracy, when applied to phenomena as dramatic as a great Atlantic storm, produces a kind of poetry, almost by accident.
The logbook was, in a sense, the keeper's only companion for long stretches of time. The only thing he wrote to, the only record of his days that was guaranteed to persist. A letter home might be delayed for weeks if weather prevented the supply boat from reaching the station. A conversation with an assistant keeper might be constrained by the formalities of rank and professional relationship. But the logbook was his. The entries made in his own hand in whatever private notation system he had developed over years of keeping records were uniquely his testimony. They are how we know him now, more than a century later. They are how he remains, in some quiet way, present. Section 7. The Long Night Watch. Night came to a lighthouse differently than it came anywhere else. On land, night arrived gradually, the sun setting and the sky cooling through its range of late colors, and then the darkness coming in from the east, while the west still held a faint memory of day. In towns and villages the lamps were lit, and the streets continued their business, modified but not stopped by the coming of darkness. People were present in numbers. The night had texture, had the sound and movement of human lives continuing through it. At a lighthouse on a rocky headland or an offshore rock, the transition to night felt more absolute. When the sun went down here, the darkness that came was the real darkness of the open sea, unmediated by any human illumination beyond the beam of the light itself. The stars on clear nights were correspondingly spectacular. Millions of them, visible in a depth and clarity that people who grew up in or near towns never experienced. The Milky Way not just visible, but vivid,
a river of cold light across the sky that seemed close enough to reach. On moonlit nights, the sea was luminous, moving and shifting under its silver surface, and the lighthouse beams swept through that moonlight in regular, steady arcs. But the beauty of the night was only a part of the keeper's experience of it. Mostly, the night was work. It was the shift that demanded the most vigilance, that most completely dominated the keeper's existence, that extracted from him the most concentrated form of the devotion his post required.
The night watch routine was unvarying. The lamp was lit at dusk, and the lens began to rotate. The keeper descended to the watchroom and settled in for his vigil. Every few hours he climbed to the lantern room to wind the clockwork, inspect the flame and the wick, check the fuel level, and satisfy himself that everything was as it should be. Between these visits he was not required to remain at the top of the tower. The watchroom was sufficient. But he was required to be awake and attentive, available to respond immediately to any problem that presented itself. A flame that guttered or failed, a mechanical problem with the clockwork, a sudden change in weather that required modifications to the operation of the light or the fog signal. Sleep during the night watch was, in theory, forbidden. The rule book was explicit on this point. A keeper who allowed himself to sleep while the light was his responsibility risked everything. If the light failed unnoticed, if a ship made a navigational decision based on where the light was supposed to be and wasn't, the consequences could be catastrophic. The dismissal of a keeper found sleeping during his watch was essentially automatic and immediate. As Trinity House's early rules made explicit, a keeper could be dismissed on the spot for two primary offences: being found intoxicated and allowing the light to be extinguished. Both amounted to the same failure of duty. Both could cost lives. And yet the night was long, and the watchroom was quiet, and a man sitting alone in the small hours of a winter's night, warm enough by the faint heat that drifted down from the lamp room, the sound of the sea a constant and rhythmic backdrop, his body tired from a full day's physical work, was fighting forces that were, at times, very nearly irresistible. The keepers who left accounts of their night watches often described the effort required to remain alert with a candor that makes the reader appreciate the difficulty of what they were doing. Keeping the mind active through the small hours, maintaining vigilance when there was nothing particular to observe, was in many ways a harder discipline than any physical task the day might demand. Some keepers developed routines within the watch to help manage this. They read if their eyesight held up in the limited light available. They worked on handicrafts, knitting, rope work, carving, practical mending. They made additional weather observations, not just at the prescribed intervals, but more frequently, training themselves to look at the sky and the sea continuously, always reading for any sign of change. They wrote in the logbook. They thought carefully, methodically, about the tasks that tomorrow would require, planning the maintenance work, reviewing what supplies were running low, working through in their minds the sequence of jobs that needed to be done when daylight returned. And they listened to the sea. The sea at night had a voice that the sea in daylight did not quite have. During the day, when there was other occupation and other sound and other visual input, the ocean was a background. At night, on watch, alone, it became the foreground. A keeper who served long enough at a coastal station learned to hear the sea with the same kind of precise attention that he brought to the lens and the clockwork. He knew the sound the water made on a normal night, and he knew how that sound changed when the wind was shifting, when the swell was building,
when the particular combination of atmospheric pressure and wind direction and tide that produced the worst conditions for ships in his area was beginning to assemble. He knew, sometimes hours before the barometer reflected it, and sometimes before any visible change in the sky, that a storm was coming. He knew by ear. This is what the long watch gave in compensation for its loneliness and its demands. It gave a knowledge of the natural world so deep and so detailed that it could not have been acquired any other way. A knowledge built not from study or reading, but from the sustained, attentive observation of a particular place, and its particular weather, and its particular water, over hundreds and hundreds of nights. The keeper, who had served 5 years at a station, had heard that station's piece of coast make every sound it could make, had seen it in every mood the sky could put it in, had felt in his own body the rhythm and the character of that place, with an intimacy that would remain with him for the rest of his life, long after he had left the lighthouse behind.
In the deepest hours of the night, the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the body's temperature is lowest and the sense of time most distorted, some keepers found that the watch produced in them a state that was neither sleep nor ordinary wakefulness, a kind of alert stillness, a clearing of the usual mental chatter, in which the sound of the sea and the turning of the light and the slow movement of the stars across the sky occupied the whole of consciousness without any particular effort, a state that was, by some accounts, not unpleasant, almost meditative, almost restful in its way, despite being nothing like sleep. Dawn, when it came, arrived first as a barely perceptible easing of the darkness to the east, a softening rather than a lightening. Then gradually, over the next half hour or hour, depending on the cloud cover, the sky transitioned from black to dark blue, to the grey that preceded actual colour, and the sea emerged from the darkness below as a flat, slightly luminous surface. The keeper, watching from the lantern room or the gallery, extinguished the lamp and stopped the rotation of the lens, and the lighthouse fell silent and still, and the morning began. Section 8. Storms and Survival. Let us talk about the storms.
Because to understand the life of a Victorian lighthouse keeper without understanding the storms is to understand it only in its quiet, moderate form, the form it took on fine afternoons in May, when the sea lay calm and blue, and the worst problem of the day was a stubborn patch of rust on the gallery railing. The storms were the thing that gave the keeper's existence its full weight and its full meaning. The storms were when the lighthouse's purpose was most completely realized, and when the keeper's duty required of him everything he had. The British coastline, and particularly the western and southwestern coasts of England and Wales, is exposed to the full fetch of the North Atlantic. There is nothing between the coast of Cornwall or the coast of Pembrokeshire and the open ocean that stretches to North America. When a depression deepens in mid-Atlantic and begins to move northeast, it travels over 3,000 miles of open water before it makes landfall, gathering energy and speed as it goes, the wind over the waves building the swell that will eventually break against the cliffs and the offshore rocks and the headlands where the lighthouses stand.
By the time a mature Atlantic depression reaches the British coast, it may be carrying winds of 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, sustained, not gusting, in exceptional cases more. And the seas that accompany such a storm are correspondingly massive. Waves in the open North Atlantic during major storms can reach 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet in height, from trough to crest.
These waves strike the offshore rock towers with forces that are almost impossible to convey in ordinary language. Engineers who have studied the impact of storm waves on lighthouse structures have documented pressures of several tons per square foot during extreme events. The towers shudder, the stone and mortar flex microscopically but measurably. The sound inside a rock lighthouse during a major storm, by the accounts of those who experienced it, was unlike anything else in the world. A continuous bass roaring from the sea striking the tower. Vibrations transmitted through the walls and floors and staircase. The lantern room glass trembling in its iron frame. And through all of it, the light continuing to turn, the beam continuing to sweep out across the chaos of wind and water, doing its work. The keeper's obligation during a storm was not reduced by the danger. It was, in fact, heightened. Storms were precisely the conditions in which ships most needed the light. In calm weather, a navigator could see the stars and use them, could see the horizon and take bearings, could operate with some margin for error. In a gale, visibility might be reduced to 100 yards or less. The ship might be being driven by wind and current in directions that made precise navigation difficult or impossible. The light in those conditions was not a convenience, it was a lifeline, and it had to be there.
This meant that a keeper who might, in fair weather, have permitted himself a somewhat abbreviated inspection routine, was, in a storm, obligated to be in the lantern room more frequently, not less. The wind could interfere with the draught through the lamp's chimney, affecting the quality of the flame. Spray coating the gallery windows could reduce the light's visibility. The mechanical clockwork, while robust, could be affected by the vibration of the tower in extreme conditions. Everything needed more frequent checking, more careful attention, precisely when everything was also most physically uncomfortable and most dangerous. The keeper's account from Godrivy Lighthouse, referenced in the Trinity House archives, describes with remarkable plainness what it felt like to maintain a solitary watch through an extended storm. The long 16-hour nights, the hours that seemed like eternities, filled with loneliness and what he called temporary frights, frights that played havoc with the nerves. The sound of the sea entering the cave below the tower, roaring like a lion through the confined space, something he could hear for hours before he understood what was causing it. The knowledge that the relief boat that was supposed to bring his colleague back to the station could not get through in these seas, and that he was therefore entirely alone, on an isolated rock, imprisoned by a sea that seemed desirous of destroying its very existence. That phrase, imprisoned by a sea. It is not a phrase written with any literary aspiration. It is a phrase written by a man simply trying to describe his actual situation accurately, and it does.
In the great storms of the Victorian period, several lighthouses along the British coast suffered significant structural damage. Waves carried away outbuildings, tore iron railings from the gallery, smashed windows in the cottage. At some stations, the sea broke into the lower levels of the tower itself, flooding the storage rooms and damaging supplies. The keeper in these situations had no choice but to make the best emergency repairs he could manage with the materials on hand, maintain the light, and wait for the storm to pass and conditions to moderate enough for a supply boat to reach him with materials and assistance. What it required of a man to stay at his post in those conditions, to keep climbing the stairs and winding the clockwork and checking the flame while the tower shook around him, was a combination of qualities that are easy to label courage, but are perhaps more accurately described as the product of deep professional habit. A keeper who had been at his station long enough had climbed those stairs in every weather that the coast could produce. The climbing was automatic, the checking was automatic. The tending of the light was so deeply embedded in his daily existence that stopping it, even when stopping it would have been physically easier and considerably safer, seems simply not to have occurred to most of them as a real option. They had accepted the responsibility. They were the light. There was no one else.
The storms also brought wrecks, and we will spend more time on that in a later section. But here it is enough to say that the keeper, watching from his lantern room during a great storm, was always watching not only for problems with his own apparatus, but for problems out on the water. Ships driven too close to shore, vessels that appeared to be in distress, the sight of a flare or a light where no light should be, or the terrible absence of a vessel that had been visible 1 hour and was gone the next. These observations and the keeper's response to them were part of the full weight of his duty in conditions that were already requiring everything he had. After a storm, the work was different. The physical toll of sustained vigilance through a major gale, the loss of proper sleep, the cold and the noise and the stress came due in the hours after the weather eased. The keeper, who had been running on something close to pure duty for 24 or 36 hours, found himself suddenly exhausted in a way that went to the bone. And the station needed attention, damage assessed, repairs begun, records updated, the supply of fuel verified, the lens given a thorough post-storm cleaning to remove whatever salt spray had found its way past the lamproom windows. And then, when all of that was done, when the light was clean and wound and ready for the evening, and the entry in the logbook was written, and the tally of damage and its repair begun, the keeper allowed himself, if there was time and the weather was steady, a few hours of rest, real rest, the kind earned by the kind of night he had been through.
The storms were hard. The storms were frightening, even for men who would not have admitted it. And the storms were, in the full span of a keeper's service, the truest test of what he was. Section 9. The Foghorn. Sound as a Lifeline. If the storm was the lighthouse keeper's greatest physical ordeal, fog was his most relentless and most grinding challenge. Fog required nothing as dramatic as clinging to a tower while the Atlantic tried to tear it apart. It required instead something perhaps harder to sustain over time: absolute constancy in the face of an invisible and indefinite adversary. Fog does not announce itself with the drama of a storm. It arrives quietly, or it builds gradually, the visibility softening from clear to hazy to poor to nothing, with a patience that a storm never bothers with. And when it arrives over the sea, it renders the lighthouse beam almost useless.
Light in fog is scattered and absorbed by the water droplets suspended in the air. Its range reduced from 20 miles or more in clear conditions to perhaps a mile in thick fog, sometimes less. The light that was the lighthouse's primary purpose was in fog its most limited tool. Which was why Victorian lighthouses at stations known for regular fog were equipped with another instrument entirely, one that operated not on light but on sound, the fog signal. Initially, this was often a bell or a cannon, signals designed to be heard at a distance sufficient for a ship to take action to avoid a hazard. But as the Victorian period advanced, the fog signal evolved into something considerably more powerful and considerably more demanding of the keeper's time and energy, the steam-driven foghorn.
The foghorn, in its Victorian form, was typically powered by compressed air driven by a steam engine, or later by air compressors in the engine room of the lighthouse. The air was forced through a trumpet-shaped horn or a diaphragm arrangement that produced a deep, powerful carrying note, a moan or a bellow that could travel miles across the water, even in thick fog. The characteristic sound of a Victorian foghorn, once heard, was not easily forgotten. Low, resonant, with a quality that was simultaneously warning and lament. Sailors hearing it in fog knew immediately where they were, or at least where the hazard was. The sound was identification as much as warning. But the foghorn demanded of the keeper a level of effort that the light alone did not. While the light's clockwork mechanism could, once wound, operate for several hours without direct intervention, the foghorn's machinery required continuous attention. The steam boilers or compressors had to be maintained, fuel had to be supplied, the horn itself had to be monitored for any irregularity in its sound or timing, and in stations where the fog was frequent, a keeper might find himself maintaining the fog signal continuously for days at a time, without any break in the obligation.
The practical doubling of the workload that fog imposed was well understood within Trinity House. Accounts from keepers describe how a foggy period transformed the already demanding lighthouse routine into something that tested the limits of what human endurance could reasonably be expected to provide. One station log from the later Victorian period records a continuous fog lasting 9 days without any significant break. For those 9 days, the keeper maintained both the light, running around the clock in such conditions, and the fog signal, both demanding regular attention through every hour of every day and night. Sleep was reduced to short snatches grabbed in the intervals between required tasks. The physical toll was considerable. There was also the psychological effect of the foghorn itself. For the keeper living and sleeping in the immediate vicinity of the fog signal, the sound that was a reassurance to sailors at sea was a physical presence that penetrated every part of the station. Deep and regular, repeated at intervals of perhaps 30 seconds or a minute, audible through the walls of the cottage and through closed shutters and through the additional pillow a keeper might press over his ear during any attempted period of rest. The foghorn did not stop for rest. The foghorn stopped when the fog lifted, and if the fog did not lift, the foghorn did not stop.
In his account of an extended period of solo duty during a foggy spell, one Victorian keeper described in his logbook the particular mental quality of the fog's combined effect, the isolation amplified by the inability to see beyond the station, the continuous low sound of the horn imposing a rhythm on every hour of every day, the ray time distorted in fog so that the same interval felt both very short and very long, depending on what occupation he was engaged in. he noted that the fog, by removing the visible horizon and the visible sea, and replacing them with an undifferentiated grey blankness, produced a feeling of being not so much in the world as adjacent to it, separated from the ordinary human geography of land and sea and sky by a curtain that might never lift. It was, by his account, the most disorientating and most wearing condition that the lighthouse service imposed. Not more dangerous than a great storm, perhaps, but more exhausting in its way, because it offered no drama, no clear beginning and end, no moment of crisis that mobilized everything and then passed. Only the fog and the horn, and the days that accumulated one after another with no particular distinction between them, except the entry in the logbook and the level of the oil in the tank.
When the fog lifted, it lifted completely, and often suddenly. One moment visibility was 50 yards, the next it was 5 miles. The horn was silenced, the valves turned off, the boilers allowed to cool. The keeper went outside and stood in the clear air and looked at the sea and the horizon and the sky, which had become, after days of grey blankness, almost shockingly present and vivid and real. He breathed the clean air. He listened to the relative silence, the silence that was still full of the sound of the sea, but was, by comparison with the horn's continuous bellow, extraordinarily peaceful. And then he returned inside and began the process of returning the frog signal apparatus to standby readiness for the next time it would be needed, because there was always a next time. Section 10. Isolation and the Inner Life.
A keeper at a rock lighthouse or at an exposed coastal station many miles from the nearest settlement was isolated in a different and more absolute sense. The supply boat came quarterly, or monthly if conditions allowed. Between supply visits, there might be weeks without any contact with the wider world, beyond the occasional distant sighting of a passing vessel. Letters arrived with the boat and left with it. News of the outside world arrived weeks old, already slightly historical. For a man posted alone, or with only the professional company of an assistant with whom his relationship was defined by hierarchy and formality, the social world contracted to something barely sufficient for ordinary human health. The effects of this isolation were documented with varying degrees of candour in the logbooks and personal accounts that survive. A keeper who had been on his own at an exposed station for weeks wrote of craving someone to talk with so intensely that the craving itself became a kind of presence, an ache that he was conscious of throughout each day. He noted with some surprise that he had gone an entire week without uttering a single word aloud, not in conversation, not in soliloquy, not in prayer, not in any form. The silence had absorbed him.
Silence of that depth and that duration has been studied extensively in contexts ranging from solitary confinement to polar exploration, and its effects on the human mind and spirit are well established. Sensory monotony, the reduction of the environment to a small number of repeated stimuli, gradually affects the mind's relationship to time and perception. Sounds become more significant. Small variations in the environment take on unusual importance. The mind, deprived of external novelty, turns inward with increasing intensity, replaying memories, constructing elaborate internal narratives, finding patterns in the random behavior of waves and clouds that a less isolated person would not bother to seek.
Victorian lighthouse keepers managed this in various ways, some more effective than others. Reading was perhaps the most common and most sustaining occupation. Trinity House recognized its importance and from 1876 onward maintained a system of portable libraries, collections of approximately 50 books each that were circulated among the lighthouse stations of the service. A typical portable library contained a mixture of history, fiction, poetry, travel writing, and scientific works, something for most tastes and most moods. When the supply boat arrived, it might bring a new library box in exchange for the old one, and the arrival of 50 new books at an isolated station was, by accounts of the period, an event that produced genuine and intense pleasure. Books were read and reread, discussed extensively in the logbook, quoted from in letters home. They were, for many keepers, the primary means by which the world beyond the lighthouse remained present and alive.
Handicrafts occupied other hours. The making and repairing of practical objects, the traditional skills of rope work and net making and wood carving, occupied the hands, while the mind was free to wander. Some keepers developed considerable skill in these crafts over years of isolated practice, their work growing more refined and more ambitious as the years accumulated. There are accounts of lighthouse keepers who produced, over the course of a long posting, remarkable examples of maritime craft, intricate models of ships in bottles, elaborate ropework objects, wooden carvings of considerable quality. Gardening, where the ground and the climate allowed any kind of cultivation, provided another form of occupied solitude. The relationship between a gardener and his garden is, at its best, a long and patient conversation, requiring attention and responsiveness, and the particular kind of hope that consists of planting something and waiting for it to grow. On a lighthouse station, where so much of the keeper's relationship with nature was of necessity adversarial, where the sea and the weather were forces to be managed and resisted, the garden was a place where a different kind of relationship with the natural world was possible. Something was wanted here, something was given, something grew.
Prayer and religious observance provided another anchor against the dissolution that deep isolation could threaten. Victorian lighthouse keepers were almost universally, at least nominally, Christian, and many were genuinely devout. The religious rhythm of the week, the Sunday observance that was expected of keepers as part of their conduct, provided a regular structure within the otherwise undifferentiated flow of days. Some keepers were permitted to leave their station to attend church services in the nearest settlement when a relief keeper was available, and these outings, modest as they were, represented contact with the community that was valuable beyond their religious content. Writing provided its own form of relief. Letters home, however delayed in their delivery, maintained the connection with family and friends that physical distance could not entirely sever. The act of writing, of putting into language what the days had been like and what one had thought about them, was also a form of processing, a way of integrating the experience of isolation into a coherent narrative that could be shared and therefore made more bearable. Some keepers wrote extensively, letters of considerable length and detail, describing their surroundings and their observations with a care that suggests the writing itself was as important as the communication.
And beneath all of these strategies and occupations, the sea and the sky were always there. Some keepers found in the sustained observation of the natural world around their station a kind of companionship that was different from, but not entirely unlike, the companionship of other people. The behavior of seabirds, the patterns of the tides, the way the light fell on the water at different times of day and in different seasons, the clouds and their relationship to the coming weather. These were not animated beings, could not talk back or offer sympathy or the comfort of presence, but they were real and they were responsive,
in the sense that they behaved according to laws that could be learned and patterns that could be recognized, and knowing those patterns, being able to read the sea and the sky as a language, was a form of intimacy with the world that the lighthouse's vantage point made uniquely possible. The men who lasted well in lighthouse service, who served for many years without any apparent deterioration in their competence or their character, seem, by the evidence of their logbooks and the accounts of those who knew them, to have been men who had found this kind of relationship with their environment, men who had discovered, perhaps to their own surprise, that the world's company was, for long stretches of time, sufficient, that the sea, properly attended to, properly listened to, properly known, provided a kind of correspondence that was not nothing, was in fact something quite profound, even in its silence. Section 11. The Keeper's Family. Women and Children at the Light.
Not all lighthouse keepers were alone. At many stations, particularly the more accessible ones, keepers were permitted and in some cases encouraged to have their families live with them at the station. This arrangement was, from Trinity House's perspective, largely practical. A keeper with his family nearby was less likely to be distracted by worries about domestic matters, less likely to request compassionate leave, less likely to fall into the depression that prolonged isolated posting could cause. The family provided a kind of stability that was good for the running of the station. For the family itself, particularly the keeper's wife, the arrangement was more complicated. The wives of Victorian lighthouse keepers occupy a distinctive and largely unsung place in the history of the service. They were not employees of Trinity House. Their presence at the station was entirely contingent on the keeper's posting. If he was transferred, they moved. If the posting was changed to a rock station that did not accommodate families, they either stayed behind in lodgings on the mainland or accompanied him only for limited periods. Their domestic life was organized around the demands of the lighthouse, not the other way round. And the quality of that domestic life varied enormously, depending on where the station was and what it could offer. At a shore station within reasonable reach of a town, the keeper's wife might have something approaching a normal Victorian domestic existence. She managed a household, raised children, maintained connections with neighbouring families, attended church, participated in the quiet social life of a coastal village. The lighthouse was the background to her life, not its entire foreground.
At a remote station, the wife's situation was considerably more challenging. A wife in a remote lighthouse posting was, in terms of social connection, almost as isolated as the keeper himself, but she had none of the professional structure that gave the keeper's days their shape and purpose. She was managing a household on a remote rocky headland, with irregular supply deliveries, no nearby market or shop, no casual social intercourse with neighbours, responsible for the domestic welfare of the family under conditions that would have tested any household manager. The Trinity House archives contain a remarkable personal account written by a keeper's wife who accompanied her husband through several different postings over the course of his career. She describes, with characteristic Victorian restraint that makes the underlying experience all the more vivid, the adjustment required at each new station, the friendships made and then left behind at each transfer, the particular challenge of raising children in remote locations with no nearby school. She describes how at one isolated island posting, she was permitted to go ashore only once per year for her husband's annual leave, one trip to the mainland per year, for everything that the mainland represented, shops, friends, family, the texture of ordinary life, she had to wait 51 weeks.
Children who grew up in lighthouse families occupied an equally particular world. They were educated at home when no school was accessible, their curriculum determined by whatever books were available at the station and whatever time and talent their parents could dedicate to their instruction. Some thrived in this environment, developing the habits of independent learning and close observation of the natural world that a lighthouse childhood naturally encouraged. Others found it lonely and restricting, longing for the company of other children that the lighthouse's isolation made impossible. The children who left accounts of their lighthouse childhoods often describe a dual relationship with the place, the simultaneous experience of it as home and as constraint. The lighthouse was where they knew every inch of stone and every sound the sea could make, where the beam of light sweeping out over the water at night was as familiar and as comforting as any domestic fixture. And it was also the thing that kept them apart from the world that existed over the horizon, the world of towns and schools and other children that they knew about but could not reach. At stations where multiple keepers were posted, the families formed their own small community, the lighthouse compound becoming a kind of village in miniature, with all the dynamics that any small contained community develops, the friendships and the tensions, the shared resources and the private grievances, the way that people who must live in close proximity for extended periods develop elaborate and delicate systems of mutual accommodation.
When a keeper was transferred, which happened with some regularity, the wife and family were uprooted again. The account from the Trinity House archives records that the keeper's wife attended 5 different schools during her childhood, each transfer of her father to a new posting requiring a new enrollment, a new beginning, a new process of adjustment. She remembered each school separately, but what she remembered most was the frequency of the disruption itself, the way that no sooner had a place become familiar than it was time to leave. And yet, set against these considerable difficulties, there was something else in the accounts of lighthouse families, a kind of closeness forged by the shared isolation that was less common in more socially connected lives. Families in lighthouses were thrown together in a way that required them to make their own world, to find their entertainment and their comfort within the small compass of the station. The evenings described in various accounts have a quality of warmth and ingenuity. Stories told and games played and songs sung in small parlours where the wind could be heard outside the walls and the beam of the light swept past the windows in its regular rhythm. The isolation that threatened the individuals within the family was sometimes the same force that drew the family together and made of it something unusually solid. Section 12. Rescues and Wrecks. Witness to Catastrophe.
There was a darker side to the lighthouse keeper's vigil, one that no amount of professional distance could make entirely ordinary or unaffecting. The lighthouse was built where it was because the surrounding waters were dangerous. Ships came to grief on those waters with a regularity that was, by modern standards, appalling. The coastline of Victorian Britain claimed dozens of ships every year, most of them in storms, most of them at night, most of them in the vicinity of exactly those rocky headlands and offshore shoals that the lighthouses were positioned to warn against. The keeper who kept his light could take some quiet satisfaction in the ships that passed safely in the night, the navigational decisions made correctly, the disasters that did not happen. But the disasters that did happen those were something else. A keeper watching from his lantern room during a great storm might see a ship in distress. He might see it clearly, lit intermittently by lightning, or visible in the sweep of his own light's beam, struggling in conditions that he could hear and feel even from the tower, the wind shrieking, the seas breaking white in the darkness. He might see it driving toward the rocks that he had spent his career warning ships away from. And he might, in a great many cases, be entirely unable to do anything about it.
This was one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the keeper's position. He was the sentinel, the watchman, the guardian, and the guardianship he could offer was only the guardianship of the light itself, the beam that had already been burning, the warning that had already been given. If a ship nevertheless came to grief, if a helmsman made a wrong decision, or the storm drove a vessel beyond any possibility of correct navigation, then the keeper watched, and he was helpless, and there was nothing to do but record it in the logbook. And if the ship came close enough and the sea permitted, do whatever was humanly possible afterward. There were rescues. The historical record contains many accounts of lighthouse keepers who rowed out into dangerous surf to reach survivors of wrecks, sometimes in conditions that any rational assessment would have declared impossibly dangerous. The moral logic of these rescues was simple. There were people in the water. The keeper could see them. He had a boat. What else was there to decide?
The most famous of all Victorian lighthouse rescue stories belongs not to a keeper himself, but to a keeper's daughter, and it has become one of the defining stories of the period. In September 1838, Grace Darling, the daughter of the lighthouse keeper at the Longstone Lighthouse on the Farne Islands off the Northumberland coast, spotted survivors from the wrecked steamship Forfarshire clinging to rocks in heavy seas. Her father, William Darling, rowed out with her in a small cobble, the open rowing boat used for inshore work, covering about a mile in conditions of wind and heavy swell that made the journey extremely dangerous. They rescued 4 men and a woman on the first trip, and William Darling returned with 2 of the survivors to bring back 3 more. The story of Grace Darling captured the Victorian public imagination immediately and completely. She was 22 years old. She was slight and, in the portraits made of her afterward, clearly an ordinary young woman who had happened to be in the right or the wrong place at the right time and had done what needed to be done. The Victorians, who had a strong appetite for stories of moral heroism in combination with personal modesty, made her famous with such intensity that the fame itself became a burden she did not particularly want. She died of tuberculosis 4 years after the rescue, at 26. Her story has never quite gone away.
But it is worth noting that the rescues less celebrated than Grace Darling's were also real, and were performed not by extraordinary people, but by ordinary ones. A keeper who spotted smoke on a distant portion of a lakeshore island and rowed 7 miles to find 43 survivors of a grounded passenger ship. A keeper who received a family from a sinking yacht during a storm and kept the most severely injured member alive through immediate first aid and communicated medical instruction. A keeper who launched his boat in the dark and the heavy sea because there was a flare and then there was nothing, and in that nothing someone might still be alive. These men did what keepers did. They kept the light, and when the light was not enough, they did what else they could. After a wreck, there was the work of accounting, the bodies that came ashore, which the keeper was obligated to document and in some cases to help recover and arrange for burial. the wreckage that washed up on the rocks around the station, which needed to be reported to the relevant authorities, the logbook entries that recorded what had been seen and what had been done, entries that might eventually be read in a court of inquiry, or by the ship's owners, or by the families of the dead.
There was also, inevitably, the emotional residue of witnessing catastrophe. The accounts left by Victorian lighthouse keepers are generally restrained in their emotional expression, because restraint was part of the professional identity of these men, and indeed part of the general cultural expectation of Victorian masculinity. But between the controlled lines of official log entries, in the rare personal accounts and letters that survive, something of what these witnesses felt can still be found. The names of ships, the approximate positions of wrecks, the number of survivors, and sometimes, just occasionally, a sentence that is not informational at all, but simply honest, the notation of a presence too large for the official record to contain.
The inspection covered everything. The lantern room first, the condition of the lens, its prisms examined for any sign of inadequate cleaning, the brass fittings of the lamp apparatus checked for polish, the clockwork inspected for proper lubrication and adjustment. The logbooks were reviewed, the weather records checked for completeness and regularity, the supply records scrutinized for accuracy. The cottage was examined for cleanliness and good order, the outbuildings were checked for structural maintenance, the paintwork of the entire station was assessed, the garden, if there was one, was noted. The standard expected was not comfortable adequacy, but something closer to perfection. The rules that governed the keeper's conduct in the station's maintenance were extensive and detailed, with the 1858 edition of Trinity House's official instructions running to those 87 printed pages, covering everything from the exact procedure for lighting the lamp, to the proper way to treat a visiting official, to the maintenance of the keeper's personal appearance and conduct. A keeper was expected to be sober, to be respectful to his superiors, to keep himself and his uniform presentable, to maintain the station in the condition in which it was entrusted to him, and to perform his duties with the constancy and precision that the safety of lives at sea required.
Dismissal was the ultimate sanction, reserved for the most serious failures of duty. Allowing the light to be extinguished through negligence or through the more serious fault of intoxication was cause for immediate dismissal. A keeper found drunk at his station while the light was his responsibility was dismissed on the spot, with no appeal and no second chance. The severity of this rule reflected the severity of the potential consequences. A light extinguished at the wrong moment, in the wrong conditions, on the wrong stretch of coast, could mean a ship lost and men drowned. The connection between the keeper's personal conduct and the lives of strangers at sea was direct and unambiguous, and Trinity House made sure that every keeper understood it. Lesser failures were dealt with by formal reprimands, entered in the keeper's official record, which was maintained throughout his career and influenced decisions about his suitability for promotion and for transfer to more desirable stations. A keeper with a clean record who had served well for many years was in a considerably better position than one whose record contained several noted deficiencies. And since promotion meant better pay and better stations, the incentive to maintain a clean record was both financial and professional. There were keepers who found the culture of strict inspection and detailed rule-following congenial, even comfortable, men who took satisfaction in the maintenance of order, and who found the explicit codification of their duties clarifying rather than constraining. For these men, the inspection was not a source of anxiety, but of confirmation, an external recognition of what they had been doing every day in any case.
And there were keepers who chafed at the rules,
who found the bureaucratic overlay on what was essentially a solitary and physically demanding job excessive and sometimes arbitrary, who resented being required to seek written permission from Trinity House before leaving their station for any purpose other than drawing their pay or attending Sunday services, who felt that the detailed prescription of every element of their duties was an implicit statement about their judgment and their competence that they found insulting. Both types served. Both types, for the most part, did their jobs. The lighthouse kept burning, regardless of how the keeper felt about the rules that governed his relationship to it. Section 14. Food, Gardens, and the Art of Making Do. There is a kind of cooking that happens at the edge of the possible, in kitchens that are small and stocked with what could be carried rather than what might be preferred, by cooks whose relationship with variety and freshness is severely constrained by geography and the regularity or irregularity of supply. Victorian lighthouse cooking was this kind of cooking, and it produced in the keepers who practiced it a resourcefulness and a pragmatism about food that was, in its own quiet way, a form of craft.
Trinity House provided for the basic provisioning of its stations. The supply boat that called at each lighthouse on its regular circuit delivered the staples: flour, salt beef or salt pork, dried peas, oatmeal, tea, sugar, lamp oil, coal for the cottage fire. These were the essentials, the basic caloric infrastructure of a lighthouse existence. They were not luxurious. Salt meat and dried legumes and oatmeal porridge formed the core of the keeper's diet for much of the year, particularly at remote stations where fresh provisions were difficult to supplement. But keepers were resourceful, and the stations themselves, even the most exposed, usually offered something that could be added to the basic ration. Fishing from the rocks or from a small boat when conditions permitted was a regular occupation at many coastal stations, and the surrounding waters were, in the Victorian period, considerably richer in fish than they are today. A skilled fisherman with a line from the rocks might bring in pollock or wrasse or mackerel in season. At stations with access to relatively sheltered water, a keeper might maintain a small boat and fish more actively, adding fresh protein to the diet in a way that made considerable difference to the quality of daily life.
Seabirds and their eggs were also taken where they could be found. The cliffs and offshore rocks around many lighthouse stations were nesting grounds for guillemots, razorbills, puffins, and the omnipresent herring gull, and their eggs, gathered carefully and in limited quantity during the spring nesting season, were a welcome source of fresh food in a diet otherwise deficient in such things. This practice was widely accepted, and indeed was simply part of the subsistence ecology of coastal life in Victorian Britain, though some keepers drew their own lines about which birds they would take and which they would not. The kitchen garden, where soil and climate permitted, was perhaps the most significant supplement to the ration. Rocky headlands and island stations were not, in general, promising agricultural terrain. The soil where it existed was thin, often acid, heavily salt-laden from years of spray, and exposed to winds that would devastate most domestically grown vegetables. But hardy varieties could be established with patience and effort. Kale and cabbage, both deeply salt-tolerant, were widespread in lighthouse gardens. Onions and leeks, root vegetables, carrots and turnips that would grow in a sheltered corner if one could be found. Herbs, thyme and mint and others that needed little beyond a reasonable soil and the absence of full coastal exposure. The practical value of the garden was not only caloric.
green vegetables, in a diet otherwise dominated by preserved and dried foods, provided nutrients that prevented the slow deterioration of health that prolonged consumption of salt provisions could produce. A keeper with a productive garden was simply healthier than one without, and the physical demands of the posting required a keeper in reasonable health. Beyond the nutritional value, the garden was also the thing that required daily tending, daily attention, daily small decisions that brought the keeper outside in weather that might otherwise have kept him indoors, that connected him to a growing, changing, living system, and gave him a small but genuine form of ownership over something at the station beyond his professional duties. Baking was another keeper's occupation at many stations. The supply of flour made bread baking possible, and a keeper who had learned to manage a bread oven, which in a lighthouse cottage was often a simple cast-iron range, could maintain a supply of fresh bread that was significantly preferable in nutrition and in morale to the hard ship's biscuit that might otherwise have been the alternative. The smell of baking bread in a small stone cottage on a winter's morning, with the sea visible through the window and the beam of the light long since extinguished for the day, is one of those details that makes the lighthouse keeper's life suddenly and completely human, in a way that no amount of description of duties and rules can quite accomplish.
At remote rock stations, where there was no garden and no fishing boat, and the supply deliveries were irregular, the diet was more constrained. The accounts of keepers at such stations describe a monotony of food that was, over extended periods, genuinely demoralizing. The same salt provisions, week after week, with nothing fresh and nothing variable. The arrival of the supply boat in these circumstances was anticipated not only for the oil and the mail, but for the simple, extraordinary luxury of fresh food, vegetables, and perhaps some fresh meat or fish that would not last more than a day or two, but that, while they lasted, seemed almost unbelievably good by contrast with what had preceded them. This was the lighthouse keeper's table, not poor by the absolute standards of Victorian working-class life, many of whom ate worse, but constrained, repetitive, dependent on the keeper's own ingenuity and effort to be anything more than simply sufficient. And the keepers who made the most of it, who kept their gardens, who fished when they could, who baked their bread and cultivated their herbs, and found ways within the narrow limits of their provisions to produce food that was recognizably pleasurable, were also the keepers who, in general, fared best in the other dimensions of their isolated existence. Because the making of good food, like the keeping of a garden, is a form of care, and men who cared well for their own small world, who attended to its details with the same precision and dedication they brought to the lamp and the lens, seemed, on the evidence available, to carry the weight of their posting with more grace than those who did not. Section 15. The End of an Era. Automation, and farewell.
All things end. Even the things that feel most permanent, most fixed, most essentially what they are, eventually change beyond recognition or disappear entirely. The Victorian lighthouse keeper's world ended gradually across the later decades of the 19th century and into the 20th, as technology advanced in ways that made the human presence at the lighthouse less necessary and then unnecessary altogether. The process of automation was neither sudden nor uniform. Different technologies arrived at different stations at different times, and the transition from a fully staffed lighthouse to an automated one was often a long, incremental process in which the number of keepers was first reduced, then reduced again, before the final step of eliminating the permanent human presence was taken. Some stations that had supported a principal keeper and 2 assistants found themselves a decade or 2 later operating with a principal keeper alone, the assistant positions abolished, as improved machinery reduced the amount of human attention the light required. Others retained their full complement of staff well into the 20th century, where the particular physical conditions of the station made automation impractical. The improvements in technology that drove this process were substantial. The introduction of incandescent oil vapor lamps in the late Victorian period, and later of electric lights, produced beacon intensities far exceeding those of the earlier wick lamps, without the associated need for constant trimming and fuel management. Automatic fog signals that could operate without human attention replaced the keeper-operated foghorns at many stations. Improved clockwork mechanisms for rotating the lens required less frequent winding and were less prone to mechanical failure. The accumulated effect of all these improvements was to reduce the lighthouse from a machine that required almost continuous human supervision to one that could operate, at least for limited periods, with nobody watching it at all. For the men who had served in the lighthouse service through the high Victorian period, this transformation was not an abstraction. It was the ending of a way of life, and the particular way in which it ended, quietly, by increments, with individual postings abolished rather than the whole service transforming overnight, meant that each keeper who received notice that his station was being restructured experienced it as a personal ending rather than a historical one.
What did a man do with a life built around a lighthouse when the lighthouse no longer needed him? Some found other positions within Trinity House or its related services, taking on administrative or maintenance roles that kept them connected to the world they had served. Some retired, if they had the means, to the coastal communities where their postings had placed them, becoming the old man who could read the weather as well as any barometer, and who remembered, when the subject came up, what it had been like to climb those stairs every morning and wind the clockwork and polish the lens. Some found that the particular habits of vigilance and precision and sustained solitary effort that the lighthouse had built into them were transferable to other occupations and made successful transitions into different careers.
But for many, the ending of their service at a specific station carried a grief that was not quite like any other grief, because it was the grief of leaving a place that had been, for years or decades, not just their workplace, but their home and their world. The lighthouse keeper who locked the cottage door for the last time and descended to the waiting boat had a particular relationship with the structure he was leaving. He knew every inch of it. He had climbed its stairs thousands of times. He had sat in its watchroom through hundreds of winter nights. He had cleaned its lens until it shone like glass that had never been touched. The lighthouse knew him, in the sense that any place deeply inhabited by a specific person carries something of that person in its atmosphere, in the worn spots on the stair treads and the marks on the workbench, and the particular quality of order maintained in the stores. He was leaving, and the light would continue without him. That was the hardest part, perhaps. The light that had been, in some meaningful sense, his responsibility and his creation for all those years, the light that he had lit and tended and kept burning through storm and fog and long winter nights, would simply continue to burn, tended now by machinery that asked nothing of anyone, noticed nothing, felt nothing, and was, in purely functional terms, perfectly adequate.
The last keepers of the Victorian era were not failures. They were not made obsolete by any deficiency in themselves. They were made obsolete by progress, which does not distinguish between things that should be preserved and things that should be set aside, but simply advances, indifferent to what it displaces. The Victorians themselves, who worshipped progress with a fervour that sometimes resembled religion, would perhaps not have found this troubling. But for the individual man who had spent 20 years of his life climbing those stairs, the abstraction of progress was considerably less consoling than it appeared in general principle. There is a particular poignancy in the Trinity House Archives accounts of keepers leaving their final stations. The formality of the departure, the handing over of inventory, the completion of the final log entry, the inspection by the relieving authority to confirm the station was in proper order. These were procedures designed for the transfer of responsibility from one keeper to another, not for the ending of the keeper's presence entirely. But they were what was available, and the keepers used them, writing their final log entries with the same careful, precise hand they had brought to thousands of entries before, recording the weather and the state of the equipment and the hour of their departure, and then closing the book. Section 16. Conclusion. What the light left behind. It is late now. The fire has burned low, or perhaps it was never burning to begin with, and what has been keeping things warm is something else entirely. The sound of the sea is still there if you listen, or perhaps it has dissolved into the general quiet, the deep and steady quiet of wherever you are. We have spent some hours inside the life of the Victorian lighthouse keeper, moving through his days and his nights, his duties and his solitude, his storms and his silences. We have climbed his stairs and wound his clockwork and cleaned his lens and listened with him to the foghorn's low, patient call across invisible water. We have sat with him through the long night watches and eaten at his plain table and stood in his small garden and read over his shoulder in the logbook where he wrote the world into words. What did he leave behind, this quiet, essential, largely forgotten figure? He left the logbooks, thousands of them, written in careful Victorian handwriting, recording the daily weather and the ships sighted and the occasional drama of a storm or a rescue, and between all the official entries, the small and human details that make history not an abstraction but a life. He left a record of attention so sustained and so particular that meteorologists and maritime historians still make use of it, still extracting information from those dusty pages about the climate and the sea conditions of the Victorian British coast. He left the lighthouses themselves, most of them still standing, automated now, maintaining themselves through circuits and timer switches rather than through a human being's steady hand, but standing on the same rocks, turning the same beams across the same water, warning the same ships away from the same hazards. The structure remains, the purpose remains. Only the keeper is gone. He left the sailors who came home, the uncountable number of men who saw that light from the water and adjusted their course and arrived safely. Men who never knew the keeper's name, never knew anything about the person who had climbed those stairs and wound that clockwork, whose quiet constancy through the night had been the thing between them and the rocks. Men who went on to do whatever they went on to do, unaware of what had been prevented on their behalf. This is the legacy that cannot be counted, cannot even be fully imagined, the sum of the lives that continued because the light was there and kept burning. We live now in a world of extraordinary information and very little attention. We have more data about more things than any previous civilization, and less capacity to sit with any one thing long enough to know it completely. The lighthouse keeper's way of knowing his corner of the world, built from years of uninterrupted observation, represents something we have traded away for mobility and variety and connection. And the trade has its benefits, certainly, but it has its costs too. The light is still out there, of course, on every major headland and every significant shoal and every harbour entrance around the British coast. The lights continue to turn. Electric now, automated, requiring no human hand to wind them or human eye to watch them. They flash their characteristic patterns into the darkness, the same patterns by which they were identified 150 years ago, when a keeper sat in his watchroom and turned the pages of a Trinity House logbook and listened to the sea and thought his thoughts in the long, quiet hours of the night.
He climbed his stairs, he wound his clockwork, he kept his logbook, he cleaned his lens and trimmed his wicks, and watched through the night, and recorded what he saw, and endured what the sea and the weather and the isolation required of him. He did it not for glory, because there was none, not for recognition, because very little came. He did it because the light had to be kept, and he was the one who had been given the keeping of it. And the light was kept. The light is still burning, and somewhere out on the water, in the dark, a ship is finding its way home. That is enough. That is, by any measure, more than enough. Let your breathing slow now, if it hasn't already. Let the sound of the sea settle around you like something familiar, something known. The light is turning. The night watch is keeping itself. There is nothing required of you in this moment, except to rest. The lighthouse keeper has done his work. The lens is clean. The clockwork is wound. The logbook is closed, and the final entry is written in careful, steady hand, and the date is set, and the hour is noted, and the weather is recorded as calm, with a light breeze from the southwest. Everything is as it should be. The light is turning. The sea is breathing. The night is deep and still. Sleep well.
Thank you for spending this time with Heyo Boring History for Sleep. If this kind of slow, peaceful journey through forgotten lives has helped you drift toward rest, please consider leaving a like, a comment, and if you've got any sleepy hype left in you, send it our way. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters more than you can imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock, wherever in the world you are right now.
It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same quiet corners of history. Subscribe if these calm voyages serve you, and we will meet again soon in another slow and peaceful corner of the past.